Thank you for coming. And this is very much a work in progress and it evolves and develops as it goes along. So please bear with me. Can you hear me? To start with, yes. Okay. So in recent years, the idea of cosmopolitanism has undergone a revival in relation to globalization and to a certain degree the Ottoman Empire, although critics of the latter and especially of an Ottoman grieving cosmopolitanism have drawn our attention to the drawbacks of such a model. This paper will attempt to work through an alternative theoretical framework, drawing from Deleuze's concept of assemblage in order to question the visual culture of the Ottoman city in the late 19th century in relation to the newly imported medium of photography. The paper will argue that the representation of the city and its people provided a double-edged opportunity. Firstly, photography furnished the means to naturalize spatial relations into a permanent landscape that appeared immutable and close to contestation, thus preempting the nationalisms that followed the fall of the empire. However, at the same time, photography also provided agency to the various ethnic communities that formed the mosaic of the Ottoman Empire in the form of the multiplicity of photographic studios that emerged within these communities. The paper will then move in parallel directions, parallel places, to the contemporary ex-Ottoman city and contemporary artistic interventions in the space of the city, thus creating Parallelotopia, parallel spaces, as opposed to utopian cosmopolitanisms, in order to discuss the transformative politics of Ottoman cultural memories by separating, juxtaposing, and recombining the dimensions of the Ottoman city. The two pairs of images, the first on the left taken from the Abdul Hamid albums by the Abdullah Frère, the photographers Abdullah Frère, and the second by the Turkish-Armenian photographer Ara Güler, Galata Bridge from 52 and Tosboga Sokak 1954 in the bottom, although produced almost 60 years apart, share some very close formal and aesthetic concerns. They are both scenes from the city of Istanbul, and the two first images are of the Galata Bridge, whereas the other two are streets from the neighborhood of Beyoğlu. The Galata Bridge, other than the addition of the trams, shares the same viewpoint, looking towards the Sultanahmet area. The street in Beyoğlu, but the addition of the street light and the lone figure can be almost identical. And a second set of four images. Again, two images from the Abdul Hamid albums and two more recent images from the series Ram Schools from the Greek photographer Paris Petridis. The first row of photos are again by the Abdullah Frère studios, and they depict the building and two students of the Imperial Lycée in Istanbul. Paris Petridis' photographs are of the Great School of the Nation from 2006, or as it is differently known, the Fanari Greek School. The two set of images, although separated by more than 100 years, engage with the same subject matter, education, and its importance as a cultural marker. But let me start by looking at the Abdul Hamid albums. So Sultan Abdul Hamid, which Wendy, of course, introduced before, allegedly stated that every picture is an idea. A picture can inspire political and emotional meanings which cannot be conveyed by an article of 100 pages. Therefore, I benefit greatly from photographs rather than written records. The art historian Wendy Shaw, one of a handful of academics who works on Ottoman photography, argued that the importance of the introduction of photography needs to be seen in relation to the field of representation in the empire. The two most important characteristics of which were firstly the absence of a tradition of perspective construction, and secondly the non-mimetic realism of manuscript painting, which formed the primary medium of illustration before photography made the realism of the new medium entirely new in the empire. Instead of replacing an existing tradition, according to Shaw, rooted in imitation, photography arrived in the Ottoman Empire contemporaneously with Western painting, thereby creating a new visual experience among practitioners and viewers alike. As a result, photography in the Ottoman Empire did not look to existing genres as did contemporary photography in Europe. Instead, it provided what Wendy Shaw calls the innocent eye. I would argue here that there were several issues that we need to take into consideration to understand the importance of the medium of photography as being dependent on a number of factors. Firstly, and most importantly, I think for me, the majority of Ottoman photographers belonged to the various ethnic communities that formed the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, the Ottoman photographers did immerse themselves within Western European aesthetic photographic debates by engaging with their European counterparts, and their correspondence reveals their technical and aesthetic preoccupations, as well as their need to be seen as equals to their Western counterparts. Thirdly, and which is my main concern here, is the political power of the images they produced in establishing an Ottoman modernity, which was contingent on the production of certain ethnic stereotypes and certain spaces of the city. I will elaborate on the above by concentrating on the Sultan Abdul Hamid albums. These albums, 51 in all, as we said before, containing 1,800 photos, were given as a gift from Sultan Abdul Hamid to the British and United States governments. The two collections are almost identical. Each album was assembled from the archive of a single photographic studio, mainly from Istanbul. The identified photographers in the collection are presented in a single album. In May 1894, the British ambassador to the Porte, Sir Philip Carey, reported that the albums were presented by the Sultan to Her Majesty's government for the use of the British public in order that it should be generally known in England what progress has been made in literature and science in Turkey since His Majesty came to the throne, and to show how greatly he is interested in the advancement of learning and education in his empire. And as we saw before, they are divided roughly in different sections: landscape, historic monuments, scenes that depict educational, industrial, and military developments, and ethnographic records of the inhabitants of the empire in ethnic costumes. The albums attempt to reverse, of course, the Western photographic eye of romanticized landscapes inhabited by harem girls and inactive sleepy men endlessly resting and smoking the nargile. As Sultan Abdul Hamid stated, most of the photographs taken for sale in Europe vilify and mock our well-protected domains. It is imperative that the photographs to be taken in this instance do not insult Islamic people by showing them in a vulgar and demeaning light. It is very important that he also stresses Islamic people here rather than any of the other ethnicities that formed the Ottoman Empire at the time. So obviously the albums were meant to reverse the Orientalist depictions of Ottoman Empire by projecting a progressive, hardworking and educated society to the Western world, and the fact that the Ottoman Empire was modernizing its education system, industry and military machine. However, the photographs seem to lapse back to those Orientalist landscapes, and here is an example, and traditional occupations like fishing in this instance, or this is a view of the Bosporus, again, very much in that Orientalist mode. However, there are several problems arising out of such a reading of the albums, which I want to address here. Firstly, the agency of the photographer seems to be problematic. Although 70% of the photographs are by the Armenian photographic studio of Abdullah Frère, there is not a single photograph in the albums of Armenian subjects, landscapes, or monuments, although there is one of some students in Van. That's the only single one I could find out of the 2,000 photographs. And landscapes or monuments, although every other ethnicity in the empire is represented in the albums. The absence of the Armenian community becomes conspicuous in its absence, and especially if it is contextualized within the historical events that were taking place at the time. So just a little historical parenthesis here. So following the end of the Russian-Turkish War of 1877-78 and the events that preceded it, which saw a growing hostility towards Armenian subjects in the empire, the Berlin Treaty, which marked the end of the war, provided certain guarantees for the Armenian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. However, Abdulhamid II attempted to stall its implementation and asserted that Armenians did not make up a majority in the provinces and that Armenian reports of abuses were largely exaggerated or false. In 1890, the Sultan created a paramilitary outfit known as the Hamidiye, which was made up of Kurdish irregulars who were given almost a carte blanche to deal with the Armenians as they wished. So the Western powers forced Hamid to sign a new reform package designed to curtail the powers of the Hamidiye in October 1895, which, like the Berlin Treaty, was never implemented. In 1st October 1895, 2,000 Armenians assembled in Istanbul to petition for the implementation of the reforms, but Ottoman police units converged on the rally and violently broke it up. Soon massacres of Armenians broke out in the city and then engulfed the rest of the Armenian populated provinces. Estimates differ on how many Armenians were killed, but European documentation of the violence, which became known as the Hamidian massacres, places the figures at between 100 and 300,000 Armenians. And here, sorry. Skipping these ones, and here is how it was reported in La Rire in France, what happened, and that's Abdul Hamid himself, what happened in the Ottoman Empire at the time. Seen within the above context, the absence of Armenian subjects from the albums provide a clue as not only projecting a modernizing image of the empire to the West, but also an empire that is peaceful and, most importantly, all-inclusive. However, do the Armenian photographers, by assembling these photographs for the Sultan, deny a voice not only to their Armenian compatriots, but to themselves as well? It is here that I want to address the Deleuzian idea of the assemblage. Deleuze sees assemblage as in terms of processes of territorialization and deterritorialization. He defines an assemblage as a multiplicity that is made up of heterogeneous terms and which establishes liaisons and relations between them. This means the assemblage's only unity is that of co-functioning. It is a symbiosis, a sympathy. It is never affiliations, which are important, but alliances, alloys. Assemblage has both territorial sides or re-territorialized sides, which stabilize it, and cutting edges of deterritorialization, which carry it away. Seen within the above historical and theoretical framework, the photos of military schools, assemblies, and drills are the demonstration of the military strength of the empire in dealing with not only the outside enemies, and especially the Russians in this instance, but also in coping with the increasing unrest within the empire. Don't forget the Greek uprising in 1821, the Balkans uprising in 1875, and the albums become an exercise in re-territorialization in order to stabilize an increasingly destabilized empire. The binding and the elaborate framing, as you can see here, each of the photographs was framed. As you saw at the beginning, the book itself was bounded in very expensive material. And the elaborate framing of the photographs provides the visible territorial sites that the Abdul Hamid regime draws as boundaries. Most importantly, seen within this context, the actions of the Armenian photographers do not produce affiliations with the state, but instead a form of symbiotical coexistence that allows them, to an extent, to deterritorialize the bounded confines of the albums and framing of the photographs by providing the alloys, the raw material from which a form of coexistence can become visible through the visibility of the photograph. My other point of consideration here that provides a parallelotopia is the aesthetic language that these images adopt. It has been argued that these photographs adopt a purely indexical approach without the pictorial language that characterized their European counterparts. However, looking at the way in which these photographs were received in Europe, and a number of them was exhibited at expositions in Paris, Vienna, and Chicago, and taking into consideration that the majority of Ottoman photographers trained under European photographers, this does not seem to be the case. In a revealing exchange between the studio of Pascal Sepah and the editor of Le Moniteur de Photographie, Sepah complained about the difficulties they were facing in Istanbul with printing techniques which lagged behind Parisian ones. In response, the editor of the journal wrote in his editorial page, "We know that for a long time there have been very good photographers in Constantinople. We are sure of this because of the beautiful examples which have been sent to various exhibitions by Monsieur Sepah and Monsieur Abdullah, including the latest methods being experimented on in France. We had not realized that the art of photography was so advanced in areas as far as away from Paris." So the editorial works in various ways, of course, by both endorsing the techniques and composition of the photographers, but also creating a certain distance from them. In addition to this, it is important to note that the Ottoman photographers catered for two markets: the tourist market of visitors to Istanbul and their demand for photographs that will take back to their homes as testimonials to their travels in the form of cityscapes and the peculiarity of exotic workers, and the local market that was mostly interested in family portraits. Sometimes the two coincided, and it is in this coincidence that the boundaries between them collapsed. In doing so, and this is the point I want to stress, photographic aesthetics reveal a process, an identity distinct from the narrative that the albums are trying to impose. It is exactly this photographic aesthetic that then becomes the cutting edge of deterritorialization, which carried away to the contemporary. Araguler's pictorialism, when seen in the context of 1950s Turkish politics towards ethnic communities, which culminated in 1955 with the expulsion of thousands of Greeks from Istanbul, does not just nostalgically look back to certain spaces of the city that are iconic, but also establishes the immutable space of the city in order to create parallelotopias that, although appear nostalgic, have the capacity to question and problematize in order to create a dynamic space of memory exchanges. In the same ways, Paris Petridis' eerily empty silent spaces of the Phanaric Greek school, with its rich architectural ornamentation, can be accused of nostalgia for a world that has almost disappeared from the fabric of Istanbul. The emphasis on the architectural is very much in line with the Abdullah photo of the Imperial Lycée and the large format camera that the artist uses in this instance exemplifies the sense of space, emptiness, and architectural grandeur. According to the artist, the schools that he photographed constitute memories that listen and an embodied interaction with the past that reveals and at the same time challenges the idea of the Ottoman Empire. The photographs asks us to view this as a fluid outcome of processes of place construction in order to reveal the layers of memory that can unfold through the parallel places and lives that emerge through them. Thank you.